Hey MBA hopefuls, we are live on the air with MBA Waves talking all things business and education. Before we get started, don't forget that hit that subscribe button, which helps us create all this free content for you on your business school journey. Today on episode 161, we're bringing the focus on the Financial Times Rankings Global MBA 2025. Today, we're here to talk about some of the big winners this year in the full-time MBA or Global MBA Rankings, what goes into the methodology, and just how this is created, and some of the novel considerations that came into play this year. I'm your host, Lucrezia, for today, joined by my co-host, Bara Sapir. How you doing, Bara?
I'm doing good. It's great to see you. Great to see you, Andrew.
Great to see you, both.
And as we already heard, we have a special guest today, Andrew Jack, our friend and third-time guest at MBA Waves, the Global Education Editor at the Financial Times. A big welcome back to you, Andrew.
Thanks. Great to be here.
Yeah, so let's kick things off with a question that we're all thinking about, right? Like the Financial Times rankings are highly anticipated every year. What's new or different in the 2025 edition, and were there any big surprises for folks this time around?
Well, in terms of the positions, of course, every year there's some movement. It's inevitable when you have all sorts of different factors and trends taking place. I wouldn't say there were radical surprises into the leading schools. You know, Wharton came top, Columbia came second. Then you also have a significant number of European schools alongside some of the other big US schools that you'll all know. So a good mix. I think pretty much all of the key schools that are very well known, the big brands, are present and perform pretty well. I know radical changes in our methodology this year, but hopefully a lot of rich insight and data coming out now significantly from the pandemic to give folks insights into the sorts of outcomes they can expect, the aims achieved, and the nature of course content.
So you just slipped by that real fast about methodology. So was the methodology exactly the same this year, and were any metrics used that you haven't used before or dropped from previous years?
No, I mean we've done a number of changes in recent years, and it's a continuing process of discussion and reflection. But this year wasn't one when there were any real big changes to the weightings or the data points we used. As you know, over the last 2 or 3 years, and we can come back to this, we've included some measures around environmental issues, for example. We've rebalanced a little bit on some factors such as the strength of the alumni network as measured by those alumni 3 years after finishing their courses. But really, we're trying to kind of, at the moment, stabilize that. Going forwards, we're going to have a few changes that we can come back to, but that we're certainly discussing quite actively. But I think this is a fairly, standard and balanced and stable sort of position that we're in terms of what we're measuring and what weights we're giving to it.
Yeah, that makes sense. What's interesting for us here, for me, is just watching. There's the universities are in the news so much more, right, than they have been, and so I've been talking with colleagues about how our business schools potentially dealing with all of the changes that are happening. I mean, the endowments are different for business schools than they are for research parts of universities. So I'm sure that hasn't had an effect at all on what's been going on, but I wonder if it'll have an effect on alumni next year, right? Some of these pieces.
Yeah, I mean, I think particularly, of course, in the US with Donald Trump's election, there's some big headwinds and tailwinds that we're looking at. I mean, as you say, it's interesting because obviously, and of course, only just this week, we had Harvard pushing back very aggressively against actions by the administration following Columbia, more generally in terms of alleged anti-Semitism, kind of attempts by the administration to, frankly, impose some pretty direct and intense forms of governance and measures for reform around student discipline and so on. Now, arguably, on the whole, the business schools don't really tend to be at the center of those areas, although there were campus protests, including at Harvard, that have been brought into these debates. Of course, business schools are also a little bit more immune than other parts of the universities, not only because the nature of students, particularly, of course, at MBA or other professional level, folks are a bit older, a bit more mature, a bit more focused perhaps on vocational and career outcomes than, for example, college students are. And of course, financially, the business schools, as we know, have bluntly been a cash cow for wider universities typically. And so they're largely seen as that, a source of revenue. And I think in that sense, you might well see central university administrations trying to exact a larger tax, if you like. But on the other hand, of course, business schools are much less reliant, for example, on government research dollars, which of course has been one of the main financial levers that the Trump administration has been trying to use to try to press through reforms. And even in the same way, and we could go on to talk more on this, but of course around issues around DEI and ESG, which have been very much to the front, of course. Again, arguably, the business school approaches have been, and ever more, are being focused on, as it were, the pragmatic toolkit sort of business application issues of these. So it's not talking about those principles for their own sake, but it's very much saying, look, the reality is, climate change, however we might argue on the causes or how to respond to it, are elements that are causing fundamental changes to business risk and decision making, supply chains, resilience, insurance, regulatory requirements, and therefore business schools clearly have a responsibility to teach tools and analysis and approaches to those areas. So I think the political climate is having some effect. We can talk again more about what impact that might have on international students coming in, or indeed US domestic students deciding perhaps to study elsewhere. And that clearly, with the recent clampdown on visas and revocations and deportations, is causing some concern. But perhaps the bigger factor we've seen in the last couple of years is more the outcome of recent economic uncertainty and the shake-up, for example, in Silicon Valley, the restructuring and therefore the reduction of jobs or the deferring of jobs in tech, but also in consulting and banking and a number of the other areas that are the classic routes that many MBAs then go on to.
Right.
Yeah, you've brought up a lot of hot topics there, and I appreciate that. Indeed, sometimes business schools are a bit more protected, as you said, but as we've seen, even private institutions that if they have a research arm or a doctorate program, they're all affected by that. And you mentioned deportations. We're up to, I think, over 2,000 at this point, international students. So I'm hearing, pushback from MBA hopefuls and even like masters, bachelors, and so on. That's like, like the path to potentially working and living in the US post degree, whatever that degree may be, is looking not so viable right now. Other people see doing an MBA, especially if it's in the US or where they have 2-year programs, as a way to like weather some kind of economic downturn storm. So there's different perspectives on that. Some people, when the rankings came out this year, and I want to point it out right away, that I think it's the first time in Financial Times history, so 26 years since the rankings existed, that European schools have dominated the top 10, which is, I think, something quite remarkable when the MBA is an American United States creation, and we have 6 of the top 10 schools coming from Europe. That's very interesting. And some people have, a lot of people have a lot of different opinions about that. But I think it's very oversimplifying things, and also just bar none incorrect to say that it comes down to Donald Trump's, presidency and so forth. It's like you have a methodology in place that is like far more intricate than just who's in the administration. And second of all, you're interviewing people who are 3 years out. So this doesn't add up to me. Where I can see space for Europeans winning in this sense is the carbon footprint metric. At the same time, that's only like 1% of the formula, isn't it? So could you respond to some of these ideas that I'm mentioning here, please?
I mean, look, I mean, first of all, you're absolutely right. I mean, it is way too early, I think, to use our most recent ranking as some sort of a barometer for what's been happening in US politics in the last few months. As you say, we have 2 sources for our data, one of which is from the business schools themselves, their administrations, and the other set is from alumni 3 years after they've graduated from their program. So there's effectively a 3-year lag in a lot of the metrics, including the ones that have the highest weighting, including salary outcome and increase. So of course, all that's been happening over the past 3 years, and really the cutoff for the data was at the end of last year, so before Trump was even elected, and pretty much before even the polls or the election itself showed that he was going to win. So yes, I think we've got to put that aside. As to differentiating between the different drivers of the relative performance of the European schools. I mean, again, yes, you're right. I mean, ESG and a couple of other factors, including diversity, for example, international variety of students and faculty, you would expect to be higher in Europe, if only because geographically, obviously, most of those countries are smaller, and they're much more perhaps focused on recruiting international students to create that globalized mix in the classroom and amongst faculty, within, of course, many US business schools with a big, domestic hinterland and different priorities and foci. That's less of a driver. You've also got sort of all sorts of nuances. For example, if you're to look at salaries, you'd have to look at where those students went to pursue their career after graduating. The fact they were at a European school doesn't mean they didn't then, for example, come to the US to work afterwards, where obviously salaries typically are higher. So really, I'm always loath to sort of come up with some magic explanation for why certain schools or even geographical regions, for example, seem to be rising or falling. Really the challenge, which is something hopefully MBA graduates are very well equipped to do, is to go into the details, to really break down and get granular and look at the different factors that make up that combined ordinal ranking and really understand the nuances. Because, first and foremost, these rankings we would consider a tool, a guide for prospective students. Of course, they're also used and can be used in different ways for employers, recruiters, alumni who've been through, who want to keep track of how their school is progressing. And then, of course, the school leaderships and managements themselves for benchmarking. But the starting point should be prospective students questioning whether to do an MBA in this case of this ranking and where to do it. And of course, they all have different reasons and motivations. Some might want to stay in a particular country or go to a different country. Some might want a more urban, some a less urban campus setting. They might want a more international cohort. They might give a high priority to gender parity, for example, amongst fellow students. ESG issues might be very important, and each of those are things that we try to capture. So I think we've really got to disaggregate in order to understand. But certainly, because the other thing, which has been quite interesting with the landscape in provision of education in business, has been this sort of fragmentation, where of course the MBA remains the flagship, and of course the US, as you say, founded 2-year on-campus experience for a sort of general business education remains really important. But we are seeing these trends to shorter MBAs, of course, to also masters in management and other degrees, some of them pre-experience, some of them post-experience, but with a deeper specialism, for example, around data analytics. That's becoming very big. We're also seeing this trend of tighter focused credentials that then can be stacked and added up to sum into, for example, an MBA or some other master's qualification down the road. So we're seeing a kind of fragmentation, a cannibalization, a kind of diversification of the offer, which sort of still makes the pattern more complex, and arguably the case for reporting on, including ranking some of these different qualifications, more important than ever.
Yeah, absolutely. To what you're saying, I mean, the MBA has definitely come from the US. It's been spreading across Europe. It's been decades for many schools. And then the reverse with Masters in Management, right? The MIM is quite a European thing, if you will, especially like in France. There's so many in the top 10, like top 15 even. It's like really French heavy. But more and more American schools are catching on to that trend and, cross-market competition. But I've always wondered, I mean, Andrew, has the FD ever considered the idea of, instead of doing a ranking, but more of a rating system, kind of like hotel stars or those green friendly energy, when you buy a house or a major appliance, like, so that would allow multiple schools to be considered in the same category based on a list of criteria rather than an ordered, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 kind of thing.
Yes, I mean it's a regular discussion. I have a lot of sympathy with the principle of that. That actually the fundamental difference, as we've discussed, particularly in these complex multiple data sets being put together into a single ranking, are quite subtle, and the difference between a number 5 and a number 6, let's say, is not radically great very often. Now, you can't always see it in our online version, but actually the print version of our ranking, we do actually effectively have a rating. What we do is group our 100 schools that we rank for our global MBA into 4 tiers. So tiers 1 to 4. Tier 1 is, if you like, the 4-star offering of roughly a dozen schools typically. And there's essentially a statistical method to differentiate those groupings. But certainly, absolutely, we label, and we encourage schools and other users to think of these bands, if you like, or tiers as being equally important measures. And so there's, if you like, less statistical variance within than there is between those bands. So a tier 1 school would be effectively a 4-star or a 3-star version in Michelin restaurant language. All
Right.
of those 100, I would say, are high quality. They meet all sorts of our requirements, including accreditation and so on. But yes, certainly the top dozen, 15 or so, depending on the year and the rank, would be considered top. And that's, it's part of a debate. But as I said, also, we try to encourage people to really dive deep and to disaggregate. So while it's great to have that catch-all focus of a grouping, I think the ordinal rankings play some role, and then the individual data points are arguably even more important, actually.
Very interesting. I don't know about. I'm going to let you ask your question just 1 second. I don't think the FT. Maybe it's available in a specialty press store here in Paris, France. I don't know if everyone has access to the print version of the FT. I certainly don't. But to help people visualize it who are listening or watching today, like, is it is it like always like by 10 or blocks of 15 schools? Are they listed in the same order as they are in the rank? Or are they in kind of alphabetical order? How do
You mean the tiers?
The tiers, yeah.
No, I mean the way we do it for simplicity is there's a different shading. The schools would still appear in the rank order, but that first tier would have a certain hue across it, if you like, and then we actually have a kind of line literally that goes across, and then we have the second and the third tiers and the fourth tier, which tend to be slightly larger numerically. So the top tier, as I say, is typically between about 12 and 15. And then the next tiers down will be, whatever, roughly 20 to 30 a piece, depending on exactly each year how the data rolls out. And we are actually looking, there are certain publication limitations on the online way to present that, but we're also looking to see if there is a way to kind of visually also present that as well to make it clearer.
Word cloud.
Well, yes. Well, that would add lots. AI.
I'm curious about. We've touched upon the criteria, and you said that it's been the same. Are there any criteria that there's been discussion about that you haven't actually included, but has come up as something that might be coming up in the future?
Well, I think so. First of all, in the ESG space, notably climate, of course, there's some pushback in the US here at the moment, but we still believe it's a fundamentally important metric to measure, and it's one that there we go, and it's one that certainly European and Asian schools, amongst others, place a high, and indeed African ones, place a high priority on. So, as a service to our readers and a reflection of the views within faculty, that's important. I think we could well see some evolutions in exactly what and how we measure both academic research in that field, which we'll come back to, course content and learning, and then the carbon footprint and the net carbon emissions targets that we're trying to set. So those are all areas that we're exploring evolutions with. Research ranking more generally is one very interested in. Of course, one of the key distinctions of a university is academic research, and hopefully the translation of those high-level intellectual ideas into practical tools and ideas that will be taught in the classroom. So we actually produced a special magazine last year. Again, I can put it into the chat, the link here, but Business School Insights. And we tried to measure what we called 3 elements of assessing academic research: rigor, so it should still be high quality, peer reviewed, credible, original, intellectually sound ideas, but coupled with relevance, i.e., does it meet societal goals, including climate? And then thirdly, resonance. In other words, are there efforts by those who produce those ideas to share them with the world of practice? And that could be both with their own students, of course, as the most obvious point of contact they have with people who are largely coming from and going back into the world of business or policy and so on. So we looked at measures of, for example, writing of teaching cases based on academic research. We're looking at citations of articles, including notably academic articles that have been picked up and referenced by non-academics, for example, in think tank reports or in government policy documentation. We also looked at patent filings and various other measures like that. So I think in that whole research space, we can certainly expect a lot more evolution. Another area that's been talked about, in fact, I was just exchanging with some thoughts with a dean on that yesterday, is around what you might call social mobility and broader issues of diversity, not popular in the US at the moment, of course. The challenge of that, of course, is each country and each culture is different. So, to measure what constitutes a minority and how effectively they're represented in a business school in China is fundamentally different from France, is completely different again from, of course, the US. So you have both a completely different point of reference. You also have big challenges in terms of getting access to credible data. At least until recently, the US, of course, did actually have very good data on certain aspects of particularly race-based hiring and so on, which of course now be sadly under threat. But to find, therefore, a consistent, relatively easy data set and apply it across the world is a big challenge. We've tried to include in our rankings the diversity of sectors that students come from, their previous employment, at least as some sort of proxy for people who don't just come out of, consulting or banking, to get some sense of context and variety. And we do take into account in our value for money metric financial aid. So there's some sense that, even if the nominal cost of tuition is quite high, notably in North American schools, there can be an offset to that in terms of financial aid at point of entry, as well as, of course, the possibility that you go on to earn sufficiently higher salaries afterwards to pay off any debt that you accrue. But, so once you get into those issues of social mobility, diversity, and so on, it's just very, very difficult. But we're always open to ideas and debating and exploring, not least around the power of AI and its ability to analyze content and research and so on. So those are areas we're certainly going to be looking at more in the future.
Yeah, really interesting. Thanks, Andrew. So switching gears a little bit, some schools that were previously ranked are no longer in the mix right now, at least this year. What can you share about those schools that dropped out this year, and how might that have happened?
Look, I mean, we only rank 100 schools. And so there's an arithmetic process around this. We often get schools saying, how come I've dropped when, our graduate earnings seem to be rising, or, we perform well in a number of the other metrics. I mean, that may well be true, but obviously if other schools performed even better, then inevitably you're going to fall in the ranking. In the same way, of course, given that we can only include 100 schools and we've got this continued growth of interest in different programs and schools around the world, some will get pushed just below that threshold of 100. I mean, we start with nearer to 200 schools that apply to be part of the process. Now, there are, as I say, the whole process of ranking with us is voluntary. Schools opt in and kindly cooperate and share data with us. I can't think of any particular examples of schools, and certainly highly regarded ones, that actually refuse to take part. Occasionally, on the other hand, sometimes there can be issues with response rates. So it's not that schools don't want to take part, but sometimes they've struggled to get the statistically representative number of alumni to complete the questionnaires that we need in order to include them. We basically have a cutoff of, crudely, a sort of 20% or 20 people in the class, as a rule of thumb, have to reply so that we can get a really representative measure of the different data points that alumni are providing. And unfortunately, partly with email fatigue, partly with COVID, and other factors, sometimes schools have struggled. But I mean, happily, if that's happened in a once-off, normally there's been a redoubled effort by everybody, and in the following year, that school has returned. So I can't point to you and say that there are a certain number of schools that have dropped off or have dropped off forever, or any particular data points that say, or trends that suggest why certain individual schools have, structurally dropped or risen. But I can say that, most of the schools that are well known and well regarded, you will see pretty much year by year, and normally in pretty high positions. I mean, the one nuance I'd add on that, and perhaps you want to ask me on this, is sort of, any year, if your school, particularly if you're an alumnus and you went to name your, prestigious school, and it's not doing so well, you get these comments from readers saying, this ranking can't be serious because my school is not one of the top ones. Well, sorry to say it, but of course everyone has an individual experience, and MBAs and schools evolve over time. Our rankings try to be objective, transparent, capture the trends that are evolving each year. And so it's a kind of rather circular argument to say, this methodology can't be valid because my school hasn't done well. The reality is, in any year, schools will change position. And what we're doing, along with many others with different rankings, is trying to capture some of those data points and nuances.
Yeah, absolutely. And in your experience, because you've been doing this for a few years, were you at the FT from the first year that it was doing the rankings, or
I was at the FT, but I wasn't involved. I only got involved about 6 years ago. Yeah, so I'm a relatively recent arrival on business education.
Well, in your brief experience, have you seen that schools that drop out tend to reappear in roughly the same band that they, of ranking that they were prior to dropping out, or is it like a slow build to get back where they were?
No, I mean, I think on the whole, the relative position of the leading schools is fairly consistent. You probably get more bouncing around lower down in the 50s, 60s, 70s, let's say, out of 100. And there sometimes, there could be something that is fundamentally overhauled, a new leadership, star academics, new approaches to recruitment that change the nature of the student body and therefore the alumni outcomes. But, I think if you went back, it would be an interesting exercise to go back, let's say 25 years and see. But I think, we've done some of that before, and you will see most of the big schools will still be there, and they'll still be in quite significant positions. And the schools that were perhaps in our second or third tier are 1-star or 2-star, if you like. Again, they move up and down, but a lot of them are frequent flyers who reappear year by year. And again, it's another way about how you slice and dice this. But a lot of the schools will themselves use benchmarks that might not be their absolute position in the global rankings, but where they sit compared to those they would consider their direct competitors. Let's say elsewhere within Europe or Asia, for example, or those of a certain class size or specialty. And so, again, by their own measures and driven in part by our data, they can often sort of stabilize themselves or perhaps rise, to some degree significantly. But yeah, there aren't radical, schools that have disappeared long term or have had to work their way up right from the bottom again, as it were, to reoccur. Yeah. As I say, there've been a few who dropped out because of statistical representation and then largely reestablished where they were in prior years. But others do emerge and come up and down, as you see each year.
You mentioned that the alumni surveyed, 20% of the class, right? So if you've got a batch of, 100 students in that program, and it's always 3 years out, right? 20% of those, at least 20 people have to respond, which is not enormous, actually. But how much does the student survey responses weigh into the total ranking? What percentage of that?
I mean, it depends on the different metric. You'd have to tally up all the different weightings which are disclosed. But I mean, if you take into account salary increase, job title, aims achieved, the assessments of the alumni network, and so on, you're well over the 50% mark of the total. The biggest individual contributions from the schools themselves, for example, would be our research rank, which is 10% of the total, and then other factors like the ESG and the diversity of faculty and students, which, if you like, is also obviously partly determined by the students, but it's the schools that provide us with that data.
Yeah. And the salary information is verified, or?
Well, the salary information it comes from the students, the alumni, but we do have various sort of benchmarks and tools and ways to assess and judge and to analyze outliers in particular, let's say, to kind of present something that's as robust as is possible to get.
Mm-hmm. All right, so should we talk about this change where Europe has dominated the top 10? Like, I don't know. How did U.S. programs compare to Europeans overall? And what are some of the shifts that you might have noticed?
Well, so as we were saying earlier, I think the European schools have often had perhaps a less focus on the standard 2-year MBA. The Masters in Management, as we've said, is kind of much more the European creation and remains a big reference point. You certainly hear sometimes, not just within the US but also within Europe, a sort of recognition that a flagship MBA can be quite a costly undertaking. It's important partly for the reputation of the school and its academic kudos for bringing in both students and faculty, and for its, if you like, brand positioning. But I think over time it's not simply a Europe versus US issue. I think it's a broader issue about questioning what the nature of business education should be going forwards. So I think one thing that's been interesting, for example, also here in the US, is to see this consistent dominant position and growing position of business or related topics, accounting, finance, and so on, as an undergraduate major, where if already you're in the US making a 4-year commitment to college education, and increasingly in an uncertain economic future, there's an appetite to often do a degree with a major that can land you a good job straight away. In the same way, I think employers often see taking students when they're a bit younger, straight out of a college program, perhaps a little bit more malleable, then be onboarded and trained in a way that's very specific to that employer or that specialism, is both sort of financially cheaper and perhaps a more productive way to leverage their skills and insights. Now, students may then, of course, go on to do an MBA afterwards, but of course, we also increasingly see these specialist degrees and these credentials that are kind of short of a full degree, although, as we said, that can be increasingly stacked. So this sort of idea of course, first and foremost, AI, digital tech skills as being a real area of growth on the one hand, and on the other, if you like, a sort of a declining level of interest in, for example, more traditional areas like accounting, where the auditing and accounting firms are increasingly struggling to attract graduates into them, and of course growing debates about the nature of the roles and how they're to some degree being automated, and how graduates are being drawn to other sorts of employment sectors, or indeed to startups and entrepreneurship, is sort of shifting the job market. So you're seeing transformation from below, partly based on evolving career aspirations and interests and costs, and you're also seeing from above evolutions amongst employers in terms of what they want and where they want to draw recruits from, and the costs also of hiring, as well as, of course, the evolutions within business school academic faculty, with growing interest in interdisciplinary research and some of the newer evolving areas, including AI, that again are kind of disruptive forces to that traditional 2-year MBA package.
for sure.
It's amazing with talking a little bit about AI, that a few years ago when we were at Columbia, that was when we first really started talking about AI. And now, like a few years later, like we're past COVID, AI is so much woven into the fabric. And so it's been a really interesting journey with that. And I just brought up COVID. How are you seeing, or are you seeing still, that COVID has had an effect on the people that you're speaking with, or has everything stabilized to pre-COVID in terms of?
Well, I mean, we had, like the schools, of course, a big period of disruption in COVID because it was suddenly students were going online, which created a big problem in terms of the assessment process, the levels of satisfaction very often, the nature of what was being taught, and simply actually the demand for business education. And then you saw falling cohort sizes, which knocked out a number of the schools because their classes were too small to be eligible for our criteria. And we didn't do that for any, malicious reason. But obviously, when you get to a very small class size, one, it's very difficult to be representative in terms of the data you're collecting. And two, to be honest, again, thinking of one of our key sets of readers being prospective students, well, if you've only got an MBA course in this case that's taking in a cohort of 15 or 20 people or something, it's maybe not quite in the same position in terms of the likelihood of getting in or the value of the course that you're going through. So there are those issues. Of course, AI, as you say, kind of coincided a little bit, or straight out of the pandemic, we went into AI. And between that and the broader tech issues of platforms and online learning, that continues to be highly disruptive. So, I think the initial shock of COVID itself is over. The adaptation and uptake of tech of all sorts in terms of learning styles and the use of AI within the classroom, as well as, of course, the broader issue about what to teach around AI, as all of those employment sectors that students are being prepared for evolve in response to it, is creating massive shake-ups and reflections at the schools. And it's number one topic, I would say, of discussion at all of the schools and the professional meetings that I attend.
A question I've been wondering for years, actually, it just came to me now, and take the opportunity to ask you. I actually, first of all, really appreciate how the rankings are set up. You can really easily pivot between years, from the first year in 1999 up to today. You can pivot between the different kinds of rankings, whether it's online, global, executive, master's in finance, MIM, and so on. And there's that regional section, right? You can choose regional rankings, and you have European business schools. So it's a school-wide, it's an institutional ranking versus a program ranking. Why is there a European business schools ranking and not Asia, North America, Canada, whatever? Like, why is it?
Well, I think, that was before my time, but I think the original decision was because, the rankings and business education more generally had been historically very focused on the US. And one of the values of the FT as historically, of course, a European media organization, was also to shine a light on the emerging area, if you like, of business education within Europe. And so to not only include those European schools in all of our main rankings alongside the Americans and the Asians, but also then to do a deep dive on Europe made a lot of sense. I would love to see a couple of other regional deep dives. I think we have periodically looked at
especially Asia.
We've done Asia Pacific. We've done it more as a directory. And we've looked, and I'm very keen to explore the idea of a US or a North American specific ranking. The challenge is largely resources. We have a pretty small team that's pretty inundated with the data cleaning and analysis already of our 7 existing assessments. I'm sorry?
Are you hiring?
Well, first of all, we need the money. If we did, we might hire. But so there's that challenge. But I have, as you may have seen in the last couple of MBA magazine's reports, for example, done a US focus as well, and pulled out some data specifically on US schools, and that's certainly an area I'd like to build. I'd also, incidentally, again, if the resources and the appetite are there, to do something looking at Middle East and Africa, where obviously there's a huge growth in the sector. Of course, the challenge again becomes, comparing like for like, and finding access to enough credible data to be able to assess them. But I think, business education and education more generally continues to grow and to grow around the world. And the more we can do some of those regional deep dives, the better.
Yeah. And so you mentioned, like, a lot of the rankings been focused more on the US, obviously brings to mind the US News and World Report, MBA rankings in the United States. But does the FT do any cross-checking or benchmarking of your rankings against some of the others like Bloomberg, US News, Forbes, QS? And like overall, I guess I want to know, what is your take on the broader rankings landscape?
Look, I'm all for competition, and I think there's some very good rankings out there. I think each of them has their own nuances. I think we remain confident that ours is amongst the more robust and credible and transparent. There's also no attempt to sort of mix any wider interest. This is a purely editorial product that is designed to serve readers, and it's actually even outside our paywall, as I say, so it's available to non-subscribers. And so that's our core focus. Of course, we look at the other rankings and their presentation and their methodology. And also, of course, you're inevitably going to make comparisons, who are the top schools and why are they different in different places, and are there things that we can learn from them? I mean, that's part of our continuing discussions. We talk to the other publications that rank, and we talk to the schools all the time, as well as all sorts of other different external networks and organizations, and of course, students, prospective students, faculty and recruiters. So we're always trying to sort of benchmark and understand and spot trends and think about ways forward to make these as useful as possible.
Okay.
So you do talk to your competitors. You do have conversations about the rankings with your competitors?
Yes, I mean, not in any antitrust sort of closed shop way, but we're informally, I'm bumping into a number of the colleagues from the different rankings organizations, including in a bunch of rankings panels that we've done at different events arranged by the business school associations and other external networks. So there's always that debate taking place. Nothing, in smoke-filled closed rooms, but plenty of informal discussions and exchanges of ideas.
Right.
Collectively let the black smoke out so we know when it's done.
We're a non-smoking house here.
I'd love to hear, Andrew, a little bit about the ranking of other MBA formats and even the high school initiatives that you're talking about, that we talked about earlier, offline. That sounded super exciting, and I'd love to hear how are students valuing the different things depending on the format.
Yeah, so we're moving a little bit beyond the realm of purely rankings here, but I mean, I do a range of wider issues around education. And so two areas of interest. I mean, one, which I've spent a lot of time on, is the FT philanthropically, if you like, has a program offering pretty much full free online access to all the FT content for high schools around the world. We've got over 5,500 schools that are part of that program. It's a very simple process. A staff member simply can register for free at our ft.com/schools-are-free site. They then have the keys to the FT, if you like, to explore and read what they find of interest. But we also work with some teachers and others to kind of help create a community of learners and identify some content and add some questions that could be of interest, that could be a way for their peers also to come up with discussion points and class materials. So we see that as a way to enrich the curricula with topical insights and reporting, to encourage critical thinking and media and global literacy, and to think about the transition to the world of work beyond high school. So thinking about potential careers and organizations that students might then go on to work from. Because of course we have lots of content there that could help them think through what it would actually like to be a lawyer, an accountant, a doctor, a government official, a senior executive in a telecoms company or a tech company, you name it. So that's the schools program. And the schools program has also been a bit of a sandbox, if you like, to explore a number of similar initiatives that we've been rolling out in business schools and universities. So we launched quite recently a thing called Professors' Picks, which basically gets professors as the experts in the classroom to signal a recent FT article, again, provide a bit of context around it and some questions, and encourage their students to read those and actually even debate beneath the article the points that they raise. So thinking about how the FT could be useful not only as general background, useful insights, but actually a direct learning tool. We flesh that out in more detail with what we call some mini cases. So teaching cases, of course, that are widely used in business schools. Historically, of course, have tended to be quite long and sometimes a bit old. So we work on article length topical issues that are fresh, work with professors to reframe them, and again add some questions and sort of pitch it as a sort of business dilemma that can be discussed in the classroom. And then a third exciting area that we're just sort of piloting at the moment is what we've called a sort of track and test tool, which allows professors to either set a specific reading list of, for example, FT articles, or simply in a gamified way, get their students to read some high quality general business, political, economic news. And then the tool will allow them to be able to track that to see how many students have read how many articles, and also generate some questions around the content to test their knowledge. So it's a way to stimulate and incentivize students to read more, and then to leverage the insights and help the professor to lighten their load both in setting and assessing student outcomes. So all of those exciting new areas, trying to sort of embed the FT as a useful tool for universities as well. Very happy to explain more on that in the future.
Sounds interesting. Do the schools ever interact with each other, or is it the school has the teacher, if it's a high school professor, like, are they just individually working with this material, or do you have a place where schools will interact and students will interact with each other?
Yeah, so first of all, they can all get in touch with us, but what we're trying to do is build this community. And so those professor picks, as I mentioned, as well as our case studies, are all available on the website. And what we hope first and foremost is that they will share them with their networks, and we share them on our social networks, for example, and through our direct contacts with business schools. And then, as I say, through the comments section in particular, we hope that students will use that as a place both to explore and debate ideas, and also raise their own profile in a way that can be useful going forwards to employers and recruiters.
Sure. I would imagine even that with high school students, it also is going to elevate their LinkedIn profile, for example. I'm seeing more and more high school students who are using LinkedIn, and if they have that kind of cachet of working through this, I think that would also be super helpful.
Yes, exactly. And I found that actually at high school, but also in a number of business schools, where we've actually already had examples where students in business classes have posted comments, put it on their LinkedIn, and that's actually raised the level of interest of employers in bringing them in for an internship or an interview. So yes, I think there's a very powerful, synergy there, or a virtuous cycle.
Right. So it's almost like you're creating an ecosystem in a way. And that
exactly right. I think we're trying to build communities. We're trying to do peer-to-peer learning and sharing, both for professors and for students.
Yeah, I can't wait to tell some of my high school students about this. I'm really excited about that. What do you think in terms of students, the prospective students? What should they focus on beyond the salary and rank of the rankings itself? What might those students be overlooking? Because some people get so fixated on being in the top 3 schools, and that's where they're going to apply. What's some advice or focus that you think should be initiated?
Yeah, I think one thing is to take it in context. As you say, it's, there are many very good schools, and there isn't one single school that is best for everything or everyone. So, pull back a little bit, reflect on really where you want to spend time studying. What's the nature of the student cohort? Would you want to be challenged by a bunch of students and faculty who come from very different cultural contexts in this globalized world, arguably a much more enriching experience? To be in another country, or certainly city, again, adds so much to your learning experience that it's incredibly valuable. So all of those wider factors are really important. Salary can, of course, be important for some, but I think it certainly shouldn't be the be all and end all. You want to look at things like aims achieved, which can be varied across the different schools and students. As I say, for some, gender balance might be important. For some, a focus on climate is certainly very important. The other thing I think, which in general, business schools themselves very often need to do more work on, is cultivating their alumni networks. So these are not just fundraising tools, bluntly, or excuses for occasional drinks, but they should actually be living networks for continued support and advice and training. And so look at the alumni network criteria that we include, amongst others. So there'd be some, and then of course, the differentiation of the university is ideas. So as long as those ideas are being both generated and then disseminated to students, then the research output is clearly a big differentiator. And obviously, often bigger schools that are part of larger universities with interdisciplinary work or options, whether in engineering, computer science, medicine, law, and so on, can be obviously also really enriching as well. So there are many opportunities around some of those bigger campus universities that are worth exploring.
Andrew, I'm glad you brought up aims achieved. Could you share a little bit of what does that get into? It's obviously on the more subjective side of things, right? Than a pure salary increase, right? It's not a calculation. So how do you take that in? How do you incorporate that into the ranking?
Sure. I'm just going to move as I talk because my plug is about to disappear with juice. But yeah, aims achieved is, we use it in we don't have a kind of a very complex set of individual questions around that. It's essentially a sort of rating overall of how highly the student considered 3 years after finishing their studies that what they'd intended to get out of their work, they did achieve. So obviously that will depend very much on the individual student. Some of them will be very focused on financial outcomes or a particular career, but others might, consider a wider liberal education, insights into the world to be at least as important. So, it's a general measure which gives a sense of the assessment overall of how satisfied a student was.
Mm-hmm.
And it's sort of, as I said, it's reflective. It's 3 years out. So, because there can be some challenges in asking for an immediate assessment. Some surveys of students sort of, are very much driven by what their latest mark was, whether they liked or didn't like a particular professor. What we're trying to do is pull back a bit here and say, overall, did the 1-2 year experience that you had as an MBA set you up? Are you satisfied today? And did it help in the skills, the values, the networks, the career that you're pursuing?
That makes a lot of sense. Yeah. You look back and you have this overall feeling like, have I been satisfied or not? Yeah. All right. So we're kind of almost up on the hour. I want to close with a couple of practical points. So maybe you could help our listeners walk through how an MBA or even master's hopeful could use these rankings as a tool to build their own personal ranking, right? To prioritize what matters to them most and help them find the best fit. What would you recommend?
Yeah, so very simple. Go to if you go to ft.com/MBA, you'll see our full editorial content, effectively, which is an online version of the magazine, the physical report that we produce each year, and it includes the highlighted ranking table, but also lots of sort of deeper reporting and advice around the broader trends, including some very useful data and infographics that try to tease out big trends and compare both with past years and with some of the other master's level qualifications, including the typical sectors that graduates go into, the salary levels over time, the course specialisms that the students after graduating consider were the best ones, that were the best taught. So all of that data and those sort of reporting insights are there. And then if you go to our actual dedicated rankings pages, which is rankings.ft.com, there you can search both the most recent MBA, but also all the other rankings that we have in even more detail from the point of view of data. And you can play around there with all of the different criteria we've talked about. You can include them all, or you can include a subset. You can rank them then by that rank order of that particular set of data that you're interested in. And you can download the whole thing into an Excel spreadsheet. And so then, of course, you can play around as you want. Now, obviously, if you look at things like our ordinal rankings, there's a certain distillation and a statistical cleaning that goes on. So you can't get all of the underlying raw data that our rankings are based on. But what you can see is either percentages and assessments or a rank order by all of the different factors we've talked about: carbon footprint, gender parity, salary outcomes. We actually provide the actual salaries. So there's a lot of data there that you can then use, and you can essentially, play around to build your own, or to look at a particular criteria, and browse on it in different ways. So then you can do a subset by country or region, as we said. You can look at salaries, or you can knock them out entirely and look at some of the other factors. And so I would encourage people to do that sort of deep dive, because, of course, as you know very well, you need as much information as possible. This is a serious commitment of time and money, and you want to be well informed. And rankings can be part of that journey. Ordinal rankings alone certainly won't provide you with all you need. Rankings of any sorts, including ours, are a part of the story. But of course, you should also go wider and talk to advisors, to the schools, to current and past students, and others who will have some degrees of insights into building up a real picture of what studying at a particular school could be like and what the potential outcomes would be.
Absolutely. I fully agree. Thank you. That's very useful. Bara, you want to wrap it up?
Well, I do want to say everything that you're saying, this whole conversation, we spent the past year talking to several business schools, and I love how they everything is really complementing each other. Everything really, even when you were talking about the different school programs where you can go from the medical school with the business school and the law school, the way that the business schools are. I always talk about a dance, right? They're in this dance, even with the rankings and with how the rankings are being presented. It seems like it's just very solid, right? Like everything that you're saying is supporting everything the business schools are saying, and everything. It's great to see that, right? I'm not seeing discrepancies, at least from the outside looking in, which I think is interesting. Do you know what I'm talking about, Eric?
That's reassuring.
Yeah, even AI, right? Even how the schools are approaching AI in the classroom, and how they're approaching AIs in applications, and how they're there's a lot of communication happening. Like, things are not happening in silos. So I think that's really super encouraging. That's my last word on this, Eric.
Mm-hmm. All right, well, let's wrap it there. Andrew, thank you so much for joining us. It was great to talk to you again. Always nice to see you. Get all the latest on this year's rankings. Very, very useful. Really appreciate it.
Oh, great to see you both, and good discussion. Look forward to doing more in the future.
MBA hopefuls, if you like this episode, don't forget to give us a little thumbs up. Follow Financial Times on, by the way, LinkedIn, and of course, subscribe to the magazine or the newspaper, and subscribe to MBA Waves to stay on top of all the latest trends and news in the world of MBAs, business, and education. Thanks for joining. Have a good week.
Thanks a lot.
Bye-bye.